The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Our guest today, author Norma Cole, has recently published a book, Final Tide, detailing the story of a young girl growing up in the Tennessee hills during the inception of the TVA project. Ms. Cole currently resides in rural Kentucky, a transfer from the city of Detroit. She'll be talking with Children's Services librarian Wendy Woodfill from the Minnetonka Community Library about the book.
Welcome, Norma. It's really nice to have you here today.
Thank you. This is quite an amazing experience.
Tell me how a Midwesterner like yourself is ended up in Kentucky.
Okay, it's a long story, you know.
Okay,
I'm probably going to take
ready.
a long time to tell it. I was born and raised in Mitchell, South Dakota. Out there, a little piece down there,
Corn
on that
Palace.
road, down where the Corn Palace is. And I went to Michigan to marry, and where I raised my family and taught school for 100 years. And one winter,
No.
it seemed like it. No, really, it was fine. But one winter, my oldest daughter, who was a child of the Vietnam era, kept saying, "Why don't we go to Kentucky and buy land?" I tell her I think she thought the world was going to end everywhere but Kentucky. And we went down there for a spring vacation, and it was beautiful. The violets were in bloom on the floor of the forest, and we walked in the woods and trees, and I just fell in love with it. And before the week was out, we bought 16 acres of a side of a mountain for $1,400. And then I didn't intend to do anything more than what I did was take the kids down to camp. And after they got too old to do this, I began going myself every spring for a spring vacation. And usually in October I'd sneak away. And one summer I decided I didn't want to teach school anymore. I wanted to write. That was the hardest words I ever said. People would say, "Why are you leaving your home and your family?" And I sort of whispered it, "I want to write a book." Because those are hard words to say. But I went down and stayed about 3 days on the side of the mountain and walked in the woods and really decided that that's what I was going to do. So on the way home that summer, I stopped in Ohio where a friend lived and told her what I was going to do. And she sent me a newspaper clipping from a want ad that someone in Ohio had a log cabin for sale. Well, it was the end of the summer. I was preparing to come to South Dakota to see my mother. And I called these people up, and they had a log cabin built. The logs were cut in 1860.
Oh, my.
It was a young couple who wanted to sell it. So I said, well, when I get home from Kentucky, I'll come look at it. And I hung up the phone, and 10 minutes later I called back and said, no, I'm going to come tomorrow. So I bought a log cabin in Ohio and had it moved to Kentucky up the side of on my property. And took 5 years then, 5 summers, to make it ready to live in and to be able to leave Michigan in my home. And I went to Kentucky with the sole goal, 2 goals. 1, to learn to write a book good enough to be sold and published, and 2, to find a publisher to do this.
Wow, and you've reached both of those
I reached both goals.
Oh, that's really
Now,
wonderful.
of course, I want to read the next one. I want the next book published.
And you are working on another book now?
Oh, sure.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about that in a
Okay.
little bit.
Okay.
Could you tell us a little bit more about where you live? You know, what the people are like and the land. And
When I went down there, I didn't know anybody. I got acquainted with the immediate neighbors who are about almost a mile away, and they were just Jess Sexton was just a dirt farmer who couldn't read or write, but a very smart man, and began to hear stories, of course, and it took me a while to catch the manner of speaking Kentuckians don't talk really what you think of real Southie, but they turn phrases and describe things in just their own unique ways. And I didn't intend to write a Kentucky story until I'd been there quite a while and began hearing the stories that later got into the book.
So you've been collecting stories for a long time?
Yeah, I think I've always collected stories.
Okay. As you said, that this one of the stories that you did collect ended up in this book, The Final Tide.
Lots of stories that I collected.
Lots of stories, yeah. There is a common thread through the story, and that is the rain and the water, and also the building of the dams for TVA. Could you tell us a little bit about the TVA, the history of it, and the impact it's had on the people there?
Actually, I'm going to go back before that. When I was born in Mitchell, South Dakota, Lake Mitchell had just been created by damming up a Firestill Creek. And in fact, I've since learned that it was actually done in the period of my infancy. But by the time I was old enough to remember, that enormous body of water was there in dry old South Dakota. And we were all just intrigued by it. And by the time I remember, they were planting trees around the lake. And I remember stories, even then, of the farmers who had to leave the creek bottom, and how angry and upset they were, because it's always the best farmland. But individual people gave up individual things for people to have, greater number of people to have better things. So when I got to Kentucky and began to hear the same stories, it was like I was hearing the same story. And Americans love to build dams. Look at the dams along the Missouri River. You know, they're there. And the Tennessee Valley Authority was set up in the 30s. And I remember my father thought that was the best work the government could ever do, was to provide this for people and to bring whole sections of the country into a modern age. I graduated from college in 1950 and went to Detroit, where I taught in a fully modern school, as modern as a 1950 school could be. But in Kentucky, I now know any number of people who taught more like 1850 than 1950, including the stories in the book about the schools. I have a friend now who started teaching in a one-room school when she was 17 years old. She'd graduate, and this is 1951. You know, we had television in Detroit. It was funny, but it was there. She had a one-room school, about the size of a good-sized living room, and there were 40 children in 8 grades, and she was but 17 years old. And not only did she teach 8 grades and 40 children, she had to go out with a bucket and carry water in, so the kids had something to drink. If it was a dark and gloomy day, then they had to go near the window. Not only did she do all this, but she made their lunch. I do a lot of speaking to children in schools, and I tell them that, you know, can you imagine your teacher teaching arithmetic and peeling the carrots for the soup that you're going to eat? And that's only 1951 is not that long ago.
No, that's the year I was born. That's not that long ago.
That's not that long ago. So it seemed natural to write the stories when I began to hear them.
Did you feel like you were an outsider looking in? Or I suppose with your connection back to Mitchell and the lake there, it probably really didn't seem that way.
An outsider in Kentucky.
Yeah.
Once they decided I was a crazy old woman and going to do what I intended to do, they're very supportive. One day some neighbors were, including a young woman, were sitting on my porch and amongst some of my company from away, and we were all visiting, and I said that remark, and my young neighbor woman said, yeah, we decided if we didn't help you out, somebody'd take you. No, I think they're very aware that I'm from away, and I am reminded that I am from away. But on the other hand, people have said to me now, you know, you've become people.
Oh.
So I feel
it's probably the greatest compliment
that they
you
could give me.
Yeah.
It's probably easier to write from a distance. I can write Appalachian stories because I don't know it all. I don't know all the turns of phrases. I've only had to listen and hear enough to incorporate into the book. Sometimes it's easier to write about something that you don't know that well.
Yeah, so you
Right.
different perspective, definitely.
Right. Well, if you want to write about Minnesota, you've got to forget a whole lot about Minnesota to pick out. You can't write everything in order to pick out what you need to do to tell your story.
How true.
Right.
One thing that comes through in the book is the connection. There's a real connection between the land and the people and family in Kentucky, and that comes through a lot.
It's still there. That's still very evident. And sometimes to the detriment of the family's growth when they're so ingrown and so reliant upon each other. They're more inclusive among themselves. I mean, they're less inclusive. They're more exclusive among themselves and not inclusive of the larger community. But that's human nature. But you asked me about the Tennessee Valley Authority, and I didn't finish that. Many of the dams were done in the Tennessee Valley Authority. That went through Kentucky and Tennessee. This idea was sold to the people in that they were going to control flooding and create electricity. And old folks down there still say, sure, they're going to control flooding. They're going to cover us over with water and we'll never be flooded again. But the dam at the one that made Lake Cumberland, the one in the Cumberland River at Wolf Creek, was started before the Second World War, but was abandoned for a while. And then toward the close of the war, work began on it again. And the people who lived in the river bottom, having had about a 15-year span, I think they began to think that the dam wasn't really, like the father in the story, that the dam really wasn't ever going to be done. But suddenly there it was. The government told the families that it would take 2 years for the water to fill up, but it filled up in 6 months.
Oh, you're kidding.
That was a winter of unprecedented rain and snow, as it says in the books. So Granny didn't have very long until she had to leave.
Yeah. Oh, right. That's amazing. People still talk about the impact that it had.
Yes.
And it wasn't all positive either,
Oh, no. It was positive from the standpoint of the greater rural Kentucky. But for the people whose lives it impacted, it was not. People, old people are still mourn their homes. I had an old man catch me on the street. Monticello's a little town the other day, and he said, "You're that woman that wrote that book." Yes, he said, "I want to talk to you." He said, "I lived right down there. You've been talking to some of my people?" I said, "I don't think so," and I named who I had talked to. He said, "Well, you sure told it true. That's the way it was." So that felt good. You know, there's a map in the book. I had nothing to do with the cover of the book, by the way. But there's a map in the book that I did draw.
Oh, okay.
This is an imaginary place inside the Cumberland River bottom that's now under 1,000 feet of water. So nobody can go down there and see if my map is true. But I've had elderly people say, "I lived right there in the bend of the river." And so it must have a ring of great truth to them. This is all my drawing. All except these little houses. At one point, when I was writing the story, I couldn't keep track of whether the kids were uphill or downhill, so I made the map. And then the editor at one point said, "I can't tell if these kids are uphill or downhill, send me a map."
I know when I was reading the book, I did refer to the map. It was really helpful to see it. Yeah, it really puts it in your mind's eye where these people are. Even though the dam is really the common thread in this book, this is really a people book, really a story of several families in that area.
Actually, a writer, I think, looks into themselves, himself or herself, to find a personal truth. And from that personal truth, tell a story that has a universal truth. The universal truth of this is displaced people. People are displaced every day by war, winds, floods, because your father decides to move and there you are, you're not home anymore. And that sense of looking for home pervades all of us. When I was in Mitchell last week, I've been back at Mitchell doing some work with children and writing. And when I am with children, I tell them, Michigan and Ohio and Kentucky where I've been, that it is their duty to write the stories of the 80s and 90s. And they must come back someday to their old school and tell those stories about the good old days. And when I was in Mitchell last week, I went back to my grade school, where I went to school 60 years ago, and laughed because I had really been saying a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was my duty to go back and tell them the stories of the good old days.
Yeah, come full circle.
Right.
That's nice.
Right.
Was Granny based on a character
Oh,
that you
yes.
knew?
Oh,
Someone
yes.
that lives in your area?
Lots of the Granny is my own mother. The cutting of the hair. My mother was a young woman in the 20s, and she got her hair cut finally. And I think for her it was liberation. It would have been hard to take care of long hair without a shower, with soap. You know, you don't remember. I remember washing my hair in soap and rinsing it in vinegar to get the soap scum out. So when Mother cut her hair, it was liberating. And the Granny in the story, as you know, cuts her hair. And for her, it was a step toward freeing herself from a burden that she didn't treasure anymore. And there's a woman in Wayne County, Kentucky, whose name is Gussie, who is definitely the model for Granny. If Gussie decides not to do it, it isn't going to be done. The real Gussie has not said anything to me about the book yet.
Oh, really? Does she know that you used
Well, I
it?
would think so. I haven't told her, but her daughter knows it, and her grandchildren know it. And they tell me. But then a lot of people have said, my grandma was like that.
Oh, yeah, I
she was
suppose.
stubborn, too.
The Granny in there talks a lot about treasures that she has, and treasures in blue jars. Could you tell us where that came from? Is that...
Actually, as I began writing the first chapter, I write from character and situation. The only thing I knew about the book was that Granny wasn't going to go, and that the girl, Geneva, was going to have to be the one who gets Granny out of there. So, but I didn't know, even until maybe 10 pages from the end, how Geneva was going to do that. I did not know what the interplay between the two of them was going to be that would give Geneva the idea to get Granny moving. What'd you ask me?
About the treasures.
Oh,
and the blue
okay.
jars.
When I was writing the first, I lose track of what you've asked and what I'm telling. The Granny, when I wrote the Granny in the very first chapter, when she looked up at Geneva and said, "You know about my treasures, don't you, child?" I did not know what her treasures would be. But little by little, as the story unfolded, I found them. I brought along a blue jar. It's a canning jar. This thing here is called a bale, and it fits pretty tight. But for the benefit of people who've never canned in these old blue jars, there was a rubber ring that went around here. And the hot jars, the jars were hot and heated. Well, when Granny was a young woman and a farm wife, she either canned their food or they didn't eat it. So her treasures from that time were food, and still treasures. Then as she got old, she put different things away to keep them, her matches. My mother was a string saver. In those good old days, if you went to the store, you bought your pound of bacon, it was wrapped in a paper and tied to the string. And you saved that string and strung it together and wrapped them in balls. Well, Granny would have had her little balls of string in a jar. The mice couldn't get in. And I also brought along the treasures that Granny had was a buckeye. I expect that nut is from an Ohio tree. Well, this is from a Kentucky tree. I expect it was called a buckeye because it would resemble the buck deer's eye, and then the eye in there too. The children in those days didn't get to go to town very often, and even if they went, they didn't have any money, so they couldn't buy a ball. So Granny makes the children each a granny ball. My neighbor and friend has a granny ball, and we picked a little corner of it apart to look in there, and we found the buckeye wrapped with string.
Oh, really?
And then 5 curvy pieces of cloth sewed together to form the ball. And it would have been the size of a softball. So then Granny makes fried pies for the kids.
Oh, those sounded so good.
And she got her dried apples out of a blue jar. And of course, in the end, but it has a bigger philosophical meaning to Granny. Her philosophy of life really is that you have treasures on earth, good food, your family, some fun, and you have treasures in heaven. You do some good work so that when you meet your Lord, he says, well, you've led a good life, you know, you've taken care of your fellow humans. And then you have treasures in blue jars. You save something for the next generation. Look, I didn't write that into it, but looking back, then I could see this thread of Granny's philosophy running through it all.
The book. Yeah.
You know, Robert Frost's poem about going through the woods and two paths diverging. Somebody asked him what the great philosophical meaning was of this poem, and he said, I just wrote a poem. So I really just wrote Granny. And then in looking back, I could see her philosophy of life.
That's great. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you came to write the book, the whole process of writing it and working with your editor and publisher?
Sure. As I say, I ran away from home in 1984 with the idea that I was going to learn to write a book good enough to be published and to find a publisher, because I did not have the faintest idea how to do that. So I began writing, and it was very difficult at first to give myself direction to go to the desk and write. And at first when I got my house done and could live comfortably, I had to say, you will be at your desk 1 hour after you get up, and you will stay there 1 hour. Whether you write or twiddle your thumbs, that is where you're going to be. But it didn't take me very long till my head knew that that was my time to write. And now I say I will go to my desk and I will stay there till noon. If I want to go back in the afternoon, I can, and even if I want to work in the evening, I do. But I must be there in the morning. One summer, my oldest daughter, who got me to Kentucky in the first place, was down to visit me. And we were out at the lake, and I said, see these hills around the lake? Those are really tops of mountains. And if you could go 1,000 feet into the river bottom, that's where people lived and had their homes and their churchyards and their schools and their stores. And before the water was coming up, everything had to be cleaned out. Everything, it had to be look like a bathtub. Nothing could be higher than 18 inches. Well, when children asked me why, it took me a while to realize that if they hadn't cleaned this out, that pretty soon the houses and barns had been bobbing around in the top of the lake. And all that timber would have gotten into the turbines that make the electricity. So that was why it had to be cleaned out. And that was, if the people could have just moved and left things, thinking that they could come back someday and see it, probably wouldn't have been so devastating. But when everything was swept away, cleaned out and gone, I think that was the devastation that the people felt. What did you ask me?
About writing your book.
Oh, okay. Well, I described all this to Laura, and she said, Mother, that better be your next book. And I knew right away I was going to write it. So within a few days, I took I had already done a lot of research that I didn't know I had done, just by listening and asking. Because I could tell Laura all that. I went to meet a Mrs. Norfleet, a lady of about 80, and I took her out, and we sat on top of one of these mountains and looked at the lake. And she cried, and she said, our farm was out there. Oh, not that far, in this way a little. She was seeing her farm. And she described it, how you went in the barns and the houses. She described the houses in the book. Her husband and his brothers farmed together on the old home place, and the little children, the little cousins, played together. And Granny lived down by the church house. She said we had the awfulest time ever with Granny. Granny was not going to leave. Granny would rather have drowned in the tide than to have left her home. I went to see a Mrs. Roberts, who was a woman my age. So she was a teenager when their family had to leave. And she told me a lot of stories. And she showed me pictures of an ordinary tide. The creeks and rivers are very prone to overflowing in Kentucky. And she showed me these pictures of their barn and pasture field full of water. She said, this is an ordinary tide, not the final tide. And I grabbed her and said, oh, Doris, can I have that? That's the name of the book. And she told me stories that she said I should not tell because they were too personal and private. I hope that I didn't tell them. She hasn't complained, so I guess I didn't. She told me about a night of an ordinary tide when she had been instructed to take the cattle to high ground. And she told me of a night of an ordinary tide when her mother had a baby. Now, women in those days didn't go to the hospital. There was no hospital to go to. And anyway, it was a night of an ordinary tide, and they couldn't have gotten out of the valley. So the baby was born at home, and it lived but a couple of hours. And her father made a little box, and they buried the baby up above the house, out of the floodwaters. And then when her mother knew she had to leave the river valley, her mother's decision was to whether or not to dig up the baby bones or to leave them there. And that thread runs through the story. We later find out that that's why Geneva's mother is distracted and kind of short-tempered, because she's trying to come to terms with her loss too.
Oh, yeah, that's something that can be expected.
So once I had established the two families, and in my mind they're double cousins. The brothers Haw married the sisters, one younger and older. But I don't think that comes out in the book. It doesn't matter. But once I had established those characters and that setting, then the story just developed from there. And as I already told you, I didn't know. I knew Granny was going to leave, but I didn't know how.
So how did you pick your publisher? Did you just send off your
Well,
manuscripts?
in the 6 years that I took to learn to write a book that was good enough, I also took time to learn how to publish. And you really you send them over the transom. You know, a transom is a little door at the top of a door.
Yeah.
Over the transom into the slush pile. And you hope that somebody reads them. At first I got nothing but raw rejections. And after 3 raw rejections, I began looking at the thing that I've written and said, now, okay, now, you're far enough from this, you can analyze this, not as something you created on this paper, but as a disinterested party. Well, then I began getting notes, personal notes from editors saying, we like this, but it isn't suitable, or we like this, but you haven't worked out the conflict between. And I had sent Margaret McElderry another manuscript, which she had rejected. And she said on the bottom of her letter, if you have written something else, consider sending it to us. Well, I had her name, then I could write, Dear Miss McElderry, this is the manuscript you said you wanted to see.
Well, I'm glad that all worked out. I'm sorry we don't have more time to
Are we out of
talk.
time?
Yes, we are. I'm sorry.
Unfair, unfair. I told you we'd have too much to talk about.
Well, I'm really glad you came today. It was really great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a good experience for me, too.
Thank you, Norma Cole and Wendy Woodfill. And thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.